We're good. So let's get started because our time is short. And I wanted to go ahead and allow our fabulous panel to introduce themselves. Let's get some icebreaker introductions. And I know that they have lots to talk about. They definitely have, they know what's going on in the world and they have differences of opinions about it. So this is good. We'll get this started. Let's go ahead and go. See, it's so much easier when we're a physical panel to say, let's go down the row. Let's see, to just call people at random. I have you in the order that's on the top of an email. How's that? How about Beth? Do you want to introduce yourself and say hello?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Haddock. I am a practitioner through and through. I have built compliance programs, managed them, helped fix them. I've learned a lot along the way. I was just describing I listened in to a panel and I plan to listen in for the rest of today and tomorrow. So I look forward to learning from everyone else in ComplianceNet. And thank you to Josephine and all the others for including me here today.
Nice. And then let's see, just in order of the email, so it's fairly random. Lawrence, keeping everybody on their toes.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Deju-Wiseman. I am a practitioner, sort of, I guess. So I started out in PwC doing forensics. I moved over. I ended up as an FX trader. I was a cash and options trader at BP, running the emerging markets FX books. And then as a poacher turned gamekeeper, again, I've now run surveillance and compliance programs. Most recently, I was at HSBC, where I was their global head of FX and commodities and multi-asset surveillance, complex asset surveillance. And now I'm at PwC, where we help clients try to figure out how to do surveillance, deal with market abuse, and figure out this strange world we're living in.
I definitely want to come back to you on the surveillance point and hear more about that as we continue. Okay, Alex?
Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. My name's Alex Chesterfield. I currently lead NatWest Group's behavioural risk team in internal audit. I'm a behavioural science practitioner, so a bit more formally, I studied cognitive and decision science. I joined the bank or internal audit from the FCA, to the UK's financial regulator, from their behavioural economics team, where we're using methods and insights from behavioral economics to try and get good outcomes for consumers and also firms and across financial services markets. And then before that, I worked at Which, so the UK consumer champion, again, setting up and leading their behavioural science team. So very new to the world of audit and compliance, but always been interested in why we do what we do and how I can bring those insights to the challenges that we're going to be discussing today.
And you have an important perspective of actually have to try to set up these programs as a regulator, deal with these programs as a regulator too. Yeah. Zach, you want to introduce yourself, please?
Of course. Hi, everybody. I'm Zach. I guess I'm a practitioner through and through too. I have spent most of my career focused on the compliance and risk space. Currently, Amanda and I are co-founders and co-leading what we call R&G Insights Lab, which is a kind of firm within a firm at Ropes & Gray. It's all about kind of taking an innovative approach to compliance and risk challenges and doing that by building off of our experience as lawyers with experts in analytics and behavioral science. Before this, was at Pfizer for the better part of the last decade, where I started off as the Chief Investigations Counsel for Pfizer in the Asia Pacific region, based in Beijing and Shanghai, and then built Pfizer's global compliance monitoring, its global compliance analytics, and its digital compliance office. So that's who I am. Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Zach. And then Amanda, please introduce yourself and let us get to know you.
I like that Zach went first because he was able to introduce the lab. But I'm Amanda Raad. I'm a partner at Ropes & Gray. I'm based in London after moving here from New York we're going on 8 years now. So I'm qualified as a lawyer, both in the US and as a solicitor here in the UK. And my practice is really split. So I would say I spend about half of my time focusing on enforcement and regulatory and defense issues, and the other half really thinking about how to achieve safe business goals. So the proactive side of building compliance program that works. And I love the focus that Alex talked about, and why, in fact, we've launched the lab of really thinking about how can we use behavioral science effectively to understand why people are doing what they're doing and help kind of achieve goals safely. So really, really happy to join the group today.
Well, thank you. It's so great to have you here. And you launched us into our first topic, which is, as you are someone who is practicing both in the US and the UK, our topic for today is a view of compliance in the US and UK practice. So could you give us your thoughts on what it looks like on either side of the pond and what the real differences are too?
Well, if that isn't a question.
Just to say good morning. We'll let everybody else take a whack at it too.
I would say, it's interesting because we use so many of the same words to describe compliance on both sides of the pond and on what we're talking about, and yet they mean slightly different things. And you think about everything from, I guess, one of the, whether you're thinking about concepts of privilege or concepts of cooperation or deferred prosecution agreements. I mean, you can go through a huge list, and while they mean slightly similar things, they are also slightly different. I think one of the things that I would call out is on both sides of the pond, regulators have really, I think, turned to a focus on effectiveness, right? Instead of here's a laundry list of the 27 things you must do, categorically, we're starting to move to, okay, the expectation is that you have a continuously evolving compliance program and that it's effective, and that you figure out how to test that and measure that going forward. And I think, some people have been incredibly frustrated by that because they say, okay, that's great, give me a little bit more. And at the same time, I think it makes a lot of sense because every organization really has to figure out for their own organization what is going to work, what isn't going to work, and it's going to have to change because whatever you put in place, you're going to have to test to see how it's doing, and you're going to have to change it. So I think the expectations are probably fairly similar. I think that, in the UK, there has been a slightly longer lead time on focusing on culture and the idea of how behavioral science can be helpful than in the US, although there's certainly tons of research there. I'm just not sure the regulators use those words as early as they did in the UK. But I'm very pleased to see that they are starting to focus on it more and that it is showing up in the guidance in a more definitive way. I think that's actually really good for everybody involved.
Let me ask you just a follow-up question, because it seems from the outside that there is a difference in the regulator's emphasis on reporting and on transparency of what comes back and allowing that to become a benchmark for the rest of the industry because people know it's happening. Do you think that that is working better and something that the US might think about adopting?
Are you talking the concept of mandatory reporting? I'm not sure the US will. Well, this goes by industry, right? I'm
Right.
not sure you're going to see a huge shift in what is mandatory. I think you'll probably see more carrots of trying to encourage people to voluntarily disclose in order to earn the cooperation credit. I think that might be just structural differences, but yeah, I'm not sure I see a huge change in that perspective. I think the US would probably say that they've had a fairly high level of reporting, not as much as you see in the financial industry in the UK for sure, but otherwise, looking outside the financial industry, I think it's probably perhaps arguably higher in the US than in the UK.
Let me let other people with transatlantic experience jump in here.
I guess I'll go next. I've worked at US-based firms, but with a global presence. So when I was at Brown Brothers, brand compliance, but there's a London office, same with Guggenheim Investments. And one thing that comes to mind is a difference in behavioral incentives. And I'll give an example in the ESG front, which even gets to Josephine, to your question. So when I think about the US, I think of a focus on wrongdoing and preventing wrongdoing, whether it's rules-based or enforcement. And then on the other hand, in my experience, thinking about incentivizing the behavior that one wants to see, sort of the desired behavior out of the UK, arguably more principle-based, more prudential. And so my work currently is on this innovative space, which is why it's so interesting to talk about these topics, because at the newer firms that I work with, whether ESG or crypto or blockchain, you have a real chance to rethink the way that you design a compliance program. And when I think of the ESG space and you look at the US, which there's been a lot of public announcements, most recently, just by way of example, the SEC released a risk alert in April. It was less than 7 pages, and it was all about gaps in compliance programs. Potentially, the intended effect has a lot of financial services companies and in different trade groups. I'm active with the National Society of Compliance Professionals, and we're spending a lot of time on that 7-page risk alert because everyone expects enforcement cases later this year or fairly soon. And on the other side of the pond, you have a taxonomy and discussion about the EU taxonomy and the UK adopting that, which is very detailed guidance. Even the announcement of the fact that you'll give definitions and taxonomy, just the announcement of that is over 60 pages. So you just take that difference of being detailed and giving guidance versus the enforcement approach. I do think that varying approach to behavioral incentives and how you want the compliance departments to run their programs is a really interesting juxtaposition to look at.
Let me let other people jump in here if they want to.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Beth on that. The difference between, and not just the US and the UK, I mean, every regulator around the world is taking slightly different approaches, and they're all trying to do the same thing, right? Every regulator wants to create a trustable, safe, transparent financial system. That's what they're all trying to do. They're taking different approaches to doing it. And what that often means inside a bank or inside a financial services firm is that you end up with a US compliance team. And by that, I don't mean a compliance team based in the US, but compliance teams all around the world devoted to making sure they comply with Reg W, devoted to making sure that they comply with US compliance programs. And then it could be in Singapore. Also in Singapore, you've got a UK compliance team who are making sure they comply with UK, and there may be teams, there may be specialists, but it creates this fragmentation that is really challenging for firms. Now, 2 of the firms that I've worked with, BP and HSBC, have both been on the receiving end of really the sort of the strongest part of the regulatory spectrum. And that's not fun. Nobody enjoys that. But one of the benefits of it is that it requires a firm to bring its entire global operations up to the same standard. So it unifies what that firm is doing. Now, I'm not potentially suggesting that we all want to be on the receiving end of heavy regulatory action, but I think as these heavy regulatory actions filter through, what they're going to do is help firms, instead of having 30 different compliance programs all sitting next to each other, to create single programs that meet all of the requirements on a global basis. And that's also going to happen as regulators start to reflect off what each other are doing. But I think we are probably still 4 or 5 years at least away from that filtering through.
Anybody else want to jump in on this?
I'm just going to say something maybe controversial in response to that. I agree with you, Lawrence, that we are probably several years away from that. But I think part of the reason we're still so far away from it is because people are still kind of waiting for the regulators to drive exactly what they should do. And I, to the extent that you move, I guess, a little bit more towards the value-based decision making and the organization setting kind of the goals of what they're trying to achieve, I think we get there a heck of a lot quicker instead of chasing this ever-moving target where you're always behind.
I couldn't agree with you more. My favorite phrase that I will hammer every time I get the opportunity is that what's unethical today is illegal tomorrow. And you have a lot of firms who are treading a line. I'm not suggesting they're behaving unethically, but are certainly treading a line of minimizing their regulatory compliance, or they believe they're minimizing their regulatory compliance cost by only complying with the letter of what's required. Instead of, as you say, thinking about the value, thinking about where we're going to be in 2 years, and helping us get there faster. No, I completely agree. We as an industry are not always helping ourselves here.
And look, I would actually take it a step further and say what's unethical today is unethical today. And to kind of put a finer point on what Amanda said, this is a good kind of demonstration of Amanda and I's relationship. I tend to be the Eeyore in this relationship. I have a little bit of more of a negative bent on things, but I mean, isn't this what we see constantly? And it's frustrating. It's in the US, it's what does the DOJ guidance say? Are we following the DOJ guidance? And that's kind of where the conversation it's not only where it starts, but it's where it focuses, and it's often where it ends. And it's a shame, because I think that the truth is that guidance is intended to be a guidance, but it's also intended to be sort of like, here's the floor, as opposed to here's the ceiling, or here's the gold standard. And I think that once, the sooner that we can, as practitioners ourselves, continue to push our clients or our companies more toward that values-based approach, and a recognition that what is unethical today is unethical today, and let's address that. Let's not just look for the illegality of things. Let's not just look for the non-compliance, black or white. Let's really live in that gray area and try to make sure that we are promoting the kind of behaviors that we as a company or our clients' companies want and can be proud of.
Let me pull in Alex, who was a regulator, and transition to our next topic, where I know she has strong feelings. What should the role of regulators be? I mean, just to throw you a huge topic, but you were thinking about the formal versus informal parts of regulation.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. And actually, I should have said this right at the beginning, as any good person working in internal audit should start off with, I wanted to say my views are very much any views expressed today are very much my own, rather than the views of NatWest Group. But actually, I really wanted to build on, Zach's point. And yes, absolutely. I think the role that we play as practitioners is really important in driving up that focus on outcomes in our organizations, rather than just inputs, and that compliance with that minimum set of standards that obviously the regulator sits. And I think that's where the formal role of the regulator really comes in, is to help get good outcomes for markets and consumers through setting, supervising, and then enforcing against those minimum standards. And so they are a minimum at the end of the day. And actually, I think one interesting idea for that formal part of regulation is moving away from that focus on inputs, but to the idea of performance-based regulation, where the regulator sets the idea of, this is the outcome that firms should be achieving, and actually they can use all their internal resources and leverage all their the expertise they have. So for example, marketing, to achieve those good outcomes for customers. So there was a specific example around the idea of getting good customer comprehension. So when a customer buys a product, there's always a challenge in financial services, given how complex the products are, the value and the outcomes are often way off in the future. So there's the onus is on customers, caveat emptor, to understand what it is that they are buying. And what performance-based regulation would do is to set a standard that actually 60-70% of customers buying product X must meet a minimum standard of understanding before that product can be sold more broadly or more widespread in that market. So I personally think that's a really interesting idea, and one which regulators would ideally explore more, both in the UK and maybe also in the US, as part of their formal role. But I also think, again, this is very much based on my experience when I was at the regulator, I also think there's a huge role for regulators to informally drive better outcomes. And by that, I mean there's an important role for the regulator to use its convening power, so to bring firms together, to help share learnings and insights from firms, again, that normally don't, because they have that very competitive mindset of, any knowledge or insights we generate should be for the benefit of our customers or our shareholders, rather than the market per se. And that's where the regulator can play a big part. So an example of that, again, in the UK, was this idea of culture sprint. So the idea was to bring, for the regulator, uses convening and facilitation powers to bring firms together around a central problem or challenge. So in this example, it was how can firms create healthy cultures? And multidisciplinary teams were brought together. So firms, compliance specialists, consultants, academics. So again, bringing, that behavioral science expertise. Why do firms, or why do people behave the way they do? Why do customers behave the way they do? Into that discussion around this central problem statement, and then coming up with ideas for firms to go back to their own organizations and experiment and test and learn in their own organizations, in their own contexts, collect that evidence, and then come back and share again collectively what worked and what doesn't. And in my experience, and again, anecdotal feedback from the regulators, that was again a really helpful way of focusing minds, focusing firms on, I guess, what is the problem, what is the goal, and then also how you might get there, given some of these questions and challenges are so hard. So I think both formal and informal, but particularly informal, will be increasingly really important. But welcome any challenge from my fellow panelists.
The floor is open.
Well, I was just thinking about your particular expertise in sort of behavioral studies. And one of the challenges I've certainly seen many times is that regulators don't really interact with front office very much. The compliance teams and legal teams usually act as a barrier, or not a barrier, that's an unfair term, but as an
filter.
Intermediary. A filter,
yeah.
Let's use that term, yes, as a filter, a strong filter sometimes, between those parties. But the front office, the commercial decision makers, are the ones who hold the purse strings, they're the ones who set the strategy or have a very, very strong impact on strategy. What can or should regulators be doing to incentivize ultimately those strategy setters and purse string holders to help compliance teams go out and get the resources? Because the things that Amanda and Zach are doing, they're not cheap for teams to do, and I mean that in terms of management time as well as cost. How do you incentivize those strategy setters to do that? How do you get that message through to them as a regulator?
I guess my immediate thought is less one of incentivization, but maybe it's more the converse, that actually, if this is an informal way of gathering these insights to get these good outcomes, sharing best practice, publicly, and holding that up as this is exemplary conduct, this is what we expect, which is partial incentive, but also the threat of, I guess, if this doesn't happen, we might have to use more, heavy-handed or approaches more traditionally associated with the regulator to get these outcomes that we want. So, for example, that performance-based regulation would be incredibly costly, for firms. And who knows if, again, this is going back to my witch days, when there's costs imposed on firms, that inevitably they get passed back down to customers. But that's a good question. I mean, how do regulators incentivize those kinds of behaviors? There is also a really strong business case as well. Again, that was a message that was frequently used, at least in those culture sprints that I participated in, is this makes sense, not just from a good outcomes for customers, but also good business sense. Healthy cultures drive performance, innovation, all those outcomes that firms want.
Why don't I jump in here? It's not as though I disagree with anything that was said, but I think I'm going to channel Zach a little bit and be Igor and say, when I look at Transparency International and that CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, we still see that the average score for fighting fraud is a failing score, right? It's a 43 out of 100. We have lots and lots of money going into compliance programs and compliance officers, but we really haven't diminished or minimized the fraud. So then you think about how effective is the current structure for compliance within organizations. And I'd offer that potentially the regulators have the power to do something very different and take maybe the best from what we think of in all of the really innovative spaces in technology and ESG and change the structure. Thinking about, by way of example, the G in ESG, what is governance? is it adequate governance that we expect a centralized compliance department to own compliance when you look at the compliance officer, the current structure under regulation is inherently conflicted. You have a compliance officer that runs a compliance department, and that compliance officer has a reporting to their own organization. That organization decides their performance and decides what they get paid. And at the same time, they have a duty to report non-compliance to regulators, a complete conflict. And as perhaps we'll get into in a little bit, at least in the US, those same regulators are going to hold them personally liable if there's a gap in the compliance program. So the structure, the governance, the way it is set up right now, to me, it's not that surprising that we have those CPI indicators that we could, maybe it's the subject of a paper for next year's Compliance Net forum, but that we could say, okay, what if we change the governance for compliance? In fintech, for instance, just one example of a regulator in New York, the Department of Financial Services, DFS, before one can be awarded a license, you have to put a compliance expert on your board. So I'm one example of that. I'm a trustee on a board of directors where there was a requirement that it's not just a compliance officer, an AML officer. It's not just a compliance department. You need to have governance that goes above and beyond so that you really can have a powerful influence on the organization.
I'm going to wait for a response for that. I think that was really powerful. I want to see what other people think here.
I'll chime in.
If nobody jumps, I want to call
I'll
you
chime
out.
in,
Yeah,
Josephine.
good, Zach. Yes.
I'll chime in. I mean, look, I think everything you said, Beth, makes a lot of sense. Like, it resonates with me. But what I would say is, and I'd love Alex to jump in after I say what I'm about to say, because I think that part of the reason why we have continued to see this cycle of investment and effort and a devotion of resources and money, but not a corresponding benefit in some cases, is because these decisions are being made, in boardrooms. They're being made by lawyers who get together and think about, what is sort of the best approach. And while everything you said really seems to make sense, Beth, I think that what we need is to bring in, more of a scientific method to what we're doing. And instead of saying, like a compliance officer, is inherently conflicted and we think this governance is better, let's actually test it. Let's actually put together different models and see which of those models is going to be most effective, and then let the science and the data drive us in a direction that's actually going to be more effective. I don't actually know, sitting here, whether that research has been done. I don't know whether or not having this structure or that is more effective. I know what my gut tells me, but my experience has also told me that sometimes a bunch of, at least in my case, lawyers sitting in a room following their gut isn't necessarily going to lead to the best result. But Alex, I'd love to.
I agree. The one thing, just to take the concept that I introduced and layer on what your feedback was, Zach, because I think it could be the same. You're in a boardroom. The directors are not necessarily all lawyers. In fact, the structure right now is where it stops, where compliance is, the chief compliance officer may be collaborating with the general counsel, or their two teams may be collaborating. And that's where you get, to me, not as strategic a conversation. But if you have the conversation at the board level where you're just not talking about disclosures, you're not just getting reports, and instead you're talking about the effectiveness, because you have a trustee that's asking, how do you know that you're focusing on the right issues? How do you know that you're getting an ROI on your compliance dollars? That type of discussion. Sorry, Alex.
No, I again very much agree with Zach, is that often there's situations where we don't know we need to look at what works and what doesn't, and a focus on, I guess, discussions at that level around disclosure would personally worry me, because again, that's that focus on that minimum standard, not what outcomes is that disclosure meant to be driving, and how do we know that the outcomes the disclosure is meant to be driving are actually happening, and if not, why not, and what's driving that, and then how do we fix the root causes of that non-compliance, which is, I'm biased as a behavioral scientist, but which is where you need that behavioral science skill set and probably design skills as well to then design systems and processes around how people are to get those outcomes, those good outcomes for customers.
Zach, let me follow up with something that you threw out earlier before we started the panel, which was a shift from finding fault to responding to risk.
Yeah.
Would that be a solution for regulators? How would your suggestions and your thoughts around that, how should regulators incorporate that into their role?
Yeah, so to me, that is less about what we should expect of the regulators and more where we should expect more of those who are regulated.
Okay.
And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with Lawrence before. It's this notion that what's unethical today is unethical today. And so shifting our mindset from compliance being this function of policing an organization to find those black and white examples of compliant or not, illegal or not, violation of policy or not, to really making sure that we're doing that. Because of course we need to do that. But if that's what we're doing, then what we're ultimately doing is identifying wrongdoing and reporting it, or investigating it and remediating it. And I think that when we move to a program that's more focused on identifying patterns of behaviors that could be reflective of risk, that could be reflective of things that are on their path to becoming non-compliant or on the path to potentially leading to illegal behavior, or maybe reflective of non-compliant or illegal behavior, but on their face, it's not clear, then I think that we're moving more toward where we want and need to be, which is more in a preventative, predictive posture than just an identify and report and investigate.
Well, let me follow up with that and just ask you, you mentioned lawyers sitting in a room trying to figure out what to do, right? And brainstorming in a vacuum. How do they really know what the emerging risks are? I mean, isn't there a disconnect there between the people who are trying to manage this system, design this system by sitting around this table, and your ideas around, what we really need to be doing is responding to risk and finding out what the risk is there. How do we, this is moving us into our next topic really about thinking, how do we reconnect compliance goals with compliance outcomes through different methods, right? How do we make sure that that group of lawyers sitting there at the table, if that's the group that is deciding what the compliance program will be, really does understand how to find emerging fault?
Yeah,
And
well,
find
so
that risk.
yeah, I mean, look, I mean, to me, this is sort of like deeply ingrained in the strategy and the vision behind the lab that Amanda and I have built, and that is that these decisions shouldn't be made by a bunch of lawyers sitting in a room by themselves, kind of trying to decide what's best for the organization. Whether it's about people. Everything that, like, my entire point of view about compliance is about people. And so whether it's designing a system, let's not design the system based just on what we think. Let's go out there and design the system in a human-centered way, in the same way that, our computers and our phones and everything that we love around us from a technological perspective is designed. Whether it's a policy, let's do the same thing. A governance framework, a control framework, let's do the same thing. And from a risk perspective, we often see risk assessments developed based on lawyers, talking to compliance and risk professionals, or other compliance and risk professionals talking to other compliance and risk professionals and auditors and folks in gatekeeper roles. But I mean, what I try to do is to say, look, like, let's go to the business and not just talk to the most senior folks within the organization. Let's actually crowdsource our risk assessments. Let's go as deep into the organization as we can to try to identify risk by amplifying the voices of those who are closest to it. And that's very rarely going to be those in compliance functions.
Amanda, let me follow up because you're involved in this work. Lawrence mentioned that there was a filtering system that the compliance department sort of has in acting as an intermediary at best between regulators and the commercial front lines. How do you guys break through that filter, if that's the filter that is being put up between the front lines and the regulators? How is it that you have access sometimes when regulators don't? And is there anything that regulators should be learning from what you're doing
Well,
that they could use too?
I was very happy to hear Lawrence talk about the silos that unfortunately get created because they're something that I think is so incredibly dangerous. And sometimes I think they get created with the best intent, so you look at an organization and they identify a particular risk, and then they say, okay, I'm going to hire a team to look at this risk, and then there becomes like this whole system around it, and then you identify a new risk that is like the new enforcement trend, and you build another team around that, and pretty soon you have like 15 different teams looking at slightly different risks, but they actually are kind of the same. And all of a sudden you're like, well, how do I even make all the compliance people talk to each other, let alone the rest, everybody else? It just becomes so complicated. And you gotta, it's not lost on me, like why people have struggled with this. And I think it's really about kind of taking a step back, and it's hard. I think a lot of organizations are reluctant to take a step back because they've spent so much time and money building up these incredibly complicated systems that to really go back and say, actually, let's get back to some of the basics. Let's look at the business and figure out like what are the key decision-making moments where we can integrate into the process, right? So, having your control function somehow become part of the business decision making and be a voice at the time in the room to strategize and solve issues together, I think should be the goal. But getting there isn't necessarily straightforward, and it can't be about the compliance or legal function being viewed as the police or the enforcer. You've got to find a way to have it part of like, let's look at all this data to figure out how you want to use it to make good business decisions, and also how you want to make those decisions and act safely. And we see situations all the time where the same set of data could be so useful for so many different purposes, and it gets stuck. You have somebody doing these really great culture reviews, and they use them for operational purposes, but maybe they don't integrate them into other places, right? And that's just a lost opportunity. So I think it's really about finding the voice, listening, using the data, making sure you access it and use it as effectively as you can, instead of getting stuck in these silos, which I think is the default sometimes. And honestly, just to say it, that there being a barrier, sometimes compliance doesn't get in the room with the regulators. I mean, I was just speaking with the Department of Justice recently about the guidance and, on a panel. And so I feel free sharing it again. They said, look, we want to hear directly from the companies. I understand, of course, it's up to their lawyers on strategy and everything else. But when it's time to come in and talk about resolution of your matter, and along the whole way, we want to hear the voice of the company too. And so it's not always even that you get the compliance officers talking to the regulators. This is a bigger kind of issue, right? And I think companies, when they're in a defensive position, which they often find themselves with regard to their regulator, are going to be very hesitant to open up their doors to their business people. So I'm not sure the regulators are going to be the solution here. I think that opening up your doors is going to have to happen internally first.
I was just going to jump in here on that, opening up the doors to the regulator. I think that, so the team I head up at NatWest, the behavioural risk team in internal audit, and was set up 4 or 5 years ago by a very progressive and enterprising chief audit exec who came to believe throughout his career in financial services that actually the root causes of organisational failure when things go wrong are inherently behavioural. So the team, we use insights and methods from behavioural science to drive very much that forward preventative view, to Zach's point earlier, of potential non-compliance, but many other potential poor outcomes for customers or the bank, So to put it into the risk speak, strategic risk, operational risk, executional risk, people risk, etc. And then what is driving those behaviors and mindsets? And then how the business can then mitigate them. And those reports, so again, the methods we use are, we speak to very much that the frontline staff. So it's that working floor reality, not what leaders say is happening in their areas of the business or what they intend to happen, but it's actually what actually happens in that area of the business, and how might those prevailing patterns of behaviors, mindsets, how might that drive risk? And those reports go to the board and to the regulators. So they, through that mechanism, they get a direct view, a direct window into what is actually happening without necessarily that filter of other units or divisions they might traditionally work with. And the feedback's been, as I said, really good, really positive. So this is my call for more organizations to set up similar teams in the third line that can do a similar thing.
Just because that's fascinating, what'd you find? Like, what was different than you expected?
Oh, so much. Process? I mean, one of the main things, I guess, is we look at the what the organization looks like on paper. So, for example, what are the performance and reward mechanisms? What are the leadership communications? What are people saying? What are the systems and processes? What does the organization look like on paper? And then how does that organization work in reality? So we do observations, almost like fly on the wall observations. So we observe actual behaviors, what actually happens. We do many, so multiple randomly selected sample of staff. So it could be people in the branch, it could be people making the online apps, it could be traders on the trading floor. It obviously depends on which area of the bank we're in. To understand again what does success mean in their area, who is seen as successful, who are the heroes, who gets recognized, what drives them, what motivates them, how is risk managed, like what are the main risks that they're managing day to day. And for me, one of the main differences we see in our work is that difference between what the organization looks like on paper, so the formal part of the organization, and those informal informal undercurrents. And it's normally the informal undercurrent or the informal drivers of behavior that leads to risk, rather than what's written on paper about how that organization works in theory, which is for me where compliance sits. It's very the theoretical part rather than what actually happens in practice. Yeah.
Well, how do we get to changing the actual behavior of people? Let's talk a little bit about this. If you find that there's a massive disconnect between what's on paper and what's lived, how do we get to that?
Let me jump in and start the conversation. It's one idea, and I think it's not that far off from what Zach was talking about, crowdsourcing. I listened in at the last session for whistleblowing and hearing about the rate of error, as well as the fact that any of us practitioners know you may spend a lot of time, and the regulators may, and the legislature may have put a lot of whistleblower protocols into legislation, but that reporting is minimally used, and it has a stigma around it about being negative. And then sometimes you're encouraging those that are looking for a bounty instead of those that are truly looking to have better governance within an organization. So one idea would be, let's retire whistleblower programs, and instead let's take the best of technology, or just the way in which we live today. We are not spending a lot of resources like refurbishing our taxi stands, right? We've accepted that we all want to democratize and decentralize the way in which we get transportation, whether we use Uber or Lyft or however, right? So when you think of compliance, if we want to address that disconnect, one idea would be to incentivize self-reporting. So instead of spending a lot of time monitoring and testing and doing risk assessments and trying to figure out priorities, why not let your employees do so using some very intuitive technology and using the incentives? You'd have to have an organization that would agree that self-reporting is a positive. It's a sign of leadership. It's not a sign of someone that is complaining. So that would be the reason to get that connection, would be to take a look at the components of the compliance program, identify anything other than whistleblowing that you might want to try and eliminate because it has a negative connotation, and really focus on increasing engagement from within. You could redeploy your auditing resources into these new types of tools. I guess I'm going to use your term, Zach, in crowdsourcing, talking about crowdsourcing for identifying compliance risks.
Lawrence, you're a big believer in surveillance and monitoring. Is that at odds with this crowdsourcing idea and the idea that actually people should be voluntarily giving you this information and letting you know what's happening inside the company? You talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in, well, it's what I do for a living. Surveillance is not so it sounds strange for someone who literally makes his living on surveillance. Surveillance is not a solution for everything. Surveillance doesn't by itself change cultures. Surveillance by itself doesn't instill value in individuals. Surveillance by itself doesn't set direction. And things Beth is talking about is all about setting value and direction and culture. But surveillance is absolutely critical for sitting alongside that. It's the trust but verify. It's the verify part of that, of the surveillance program. The thing Zach was talking about becoming proactive, about looking for risks before they occur. Surveillance programs, we're very, very good already at listening to telephone calls and checking that if someone says, hey, let's spoof the markets, go, 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 we're going to catch that. There's tons of technology out there, there's processes out there, we're good at that. Likewise, if someone is engaging in classic wash trading behavior, if someone is engaging in classic ramping behavior, there are tons of pieces of technology out there that we implement for our clients that have been market standard for a while that can solve those problems. What we're now looking at are things called integrated surveillance or holistic surveillance or behavioral analytics. And what they are doing is they're looking for changes in behavior that indicate that a risk might be coming in the future. And that's where surveillance, I think, takes us to that next generation. It's looking at the people that a person communicates with, and that suddenly shifts overnight. It's looking at things that, combined with they've started working different hours, combined with they've started accessing different systems that maybe, although they technically are permitted to access, why are they accessing those? And it creates a behavioral profile that indicates, hang on a minute, something might be about to happen. There are changes in behavior that we're starting to see, but that all sits alongside the embedding of value and the embedding of self-reporting that Beth's talking about. I don't think either one of these replaces the other because they're accomplishing very, very different things. So I think surveillance is critical. I think surveillance is going to continue to be very important for us, but we should never look to any one approach to compliance to being the solution. Much as I'd love to say that I can solve everyone's compliance problems, I definitely can't.
Let me ask you whether surveillance can actually, and just throwing this out there, make things worse in the sense that, you have someone who you're asking them to volunteer, information about their boss or something else that puts them in a precarious position. And then instead of necessarily getting the message that they're trusted and welcomed, they're finding out that you're listening to their phone calls and that you're doing all these things and you've upped their surveillance on them because suddenly, they've changed their patterns or something else. We have some evidence that can lead to the loss of women, minorities in particular, who experience surveillance as much more oppressive than other groups, and also star performers tend to leave when there's over surveillance. And let me ask you about that. Aren't those the people that you need, especially if you have a situation where you have, say, groupthink? We have sometimes situations where there's something happening in a department. Why? Because everyone's got their each other's backs, and that's the way it happens, and wink, wink, nod, nod, and, you know, these are going to be the new numbers and nobody's really going to ask. And to get a new person in there is the moment when questions are asked for the first time, and that can be uncomfortable for the group. And you could see that there could be, you know, it can be difficult to be the new person in that situation, and especially the new person with a diverse perspective, and we need those new people. So to find out that surveillance is the thing that tends to drive those people out most and fastest, should we be rethinking how we do surveillance, or rethinking the experience of surveillance? Can you talk to me a little bit about this?
Absolutely. So the first thing I say is surveillance uncovers all sorts of ethical and personal challenges. And the first thing with surveillance is it should never be secret. Surveillance officers are not spies. And they should never see themselves as that. Surveillance officers are partners for the business, and they should be very open and very clear, and I as a surveillance officer always am, with our businesses about what we're doing. So I will work with the business, and they will know the types of surveillance that we are putting in place. They won't know the exact, for example, we won't tell them here are the list of words that will set off an alert, because that obviously creates conflict and then they can avoid those words. But they will know that their telephone calls are recorded and that they're monitored, and they're monitored in a particular way using an automated system, or using staff that are listening to them under certain additional NDAs. But you have to be very transparent about that. You should never be relying on individuals within a department to surveil on each other. Surveillance should be sitting as an independent function outside of that department. And I can absolutely see how it would affect, and I've seen how it does affect potentially individuals who don't feel that they are part of the in group. But actually good surveillance will detect the risk of those individuals being ostracized. Good surveillance should actually detect that individuals are being cut out of email chains, that individuals' views are being ignored, that derogatory remarks about individuals are being made in private conversations. Good surveillance should actually pick that up. Or detect, for example, that P&L is not being distributed in a fair way, and that certain people, and you might find that those people, and I've seen this, those people have other protected characteristics, are not receiving equitable distributions. And surveillance should actually serve to enhance diversity and enhance the experience of those individuals if it's done correctly. But it all starts with that transparency and that independence.
Isn't there a lot of evidence that it actually tends to drum out whistleblowers? So, for example, if you're going to pick out and you have this issue, right? If you know, you're a very ethical compliance officer who's on the other end of the surveillance, but we're hearing about, especially as you describe, you know, the patterns of who you communicate with and how you talk to them, and you know, all these other things. What you're doing, you can map the networks of relationships within a department, and you can map the language of, you know, there are services that are doing this, that are mapping the language that a team uses to find out who fits into the team and uses that language and who doesn't. And that's often how you can find the whistleblower. You can find the person who thinks differently from the rest of the team. And there's some evidence that that's the way some of this surveillance software is being used. Now, going back to Beth's point about how difficult it is to be a whistleblower anyway, and maybe we should do away with the term and the whole, you know, responsibility that we're putting on people to swim against the stream so hard to their own detriment. Isn't there this tremendous potential to actually, in the wrong hands, have that surveillance be used against whistleblowers? We've also seen Amazon potentially use it against union organization activities. We've seen other firms use it for other control purposes that, let's say, would not be what your most ethical compliance officer should be doing with this system. So talk to me about the rails on the system, and how do we put limits on the use of surveillance or the use of the results of the surveillance such that we do protect, say, the whistleblowers, as long as we have this system, the people who are illegally unionizing, or the people who are, you know, otherwise in protected categories of behavioral activity, because often you're seeing this surveillance sort of find them and drum them out in other ways.
So there's the answer to your question, first of all, is yes, of course. And we've seen it many, many times that there is misuse of the technology, of the tools, and of the skill sets. Surveillance needs to be, and this is where setting up surveillance programs becomes very difficult. Surveillance is not the little sibling of compliance. It's not the little sibling of the front office, and it's not the little sibling of internal audit. It needs to sit in many ways outside those reporting chains, and it needs to have independence so that it cannot be misused for those purposes. When I sit in surveillance, so when I sat as a surveillance officer as opposed to in the consulting role I now have, but when I sat as a surveillance officer, I had access to incredibly detailed personal information of individuals. Now, in addition to having signed additional NDAs and having had additional training, even on top of all that, it's entirely feasible that someone very senior in the bank could have pulled me aside, or very senior in any organization could have pulled me aside, pulled me into a room and said, Lawrence, if you fancy still working here next week, I'm going to need you to do the following. The only way you're protected from that is having senior surveillance as governance that is, and this goes back to Beth's point about getting governance right, is having senior surveillance governance that you have absolute confidence in as a junior surveillance officer that will protect you. That one are trying to do the right thing, and that tone has to come down from the board, because the board has to lead the way in picking surveillance leadership that are willing to protect and support their surveillance officers. And then separately, you actually have to find individuals who are really have that strength of character and strength of professionalism to do that. And that is not easy. And that is a real challenge. Good surveillance leadership is as valuable as gold in our industry. Sorry.
No, apologies. I didn't mean to. I had a quick question, but yeah. I'll let you finish. Sorry, Lawrence.
No, I mean, I think that's the answer, because there is no technology control, there is no procedural control, there is no process that is going to prevent this. The only thing that's going to prevent it is actually having the right people doing it and the right people governing it.
So one idea, because I think it's such an interesting point that Josephine raised, is can you address this real risk with, think of what goes on in data aggregation today. Would you be comfortable if all of the surveillance of an organization was anonymized and aggregated and reported out in full transparency so that there was no secrecy and potentially any stakeholder could see the results of an organization's surveillance efforts?
In terms of seeing the results, I think, and we do have MI and reporting already. I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think fundamentally there's something wrong with the idea that you would report the MI of what you're doing and how you're doing it. I mean, yeah, the anonymization and aggregation would have to be extremely well performed. But no, I don't think there is anything wrong fundamentally with creating a layer of transparency and saying, here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it, and here's what it's found.
To wrap up this topic, let me pull in Zach and Amanda, who I know are on the same team, but have come out with different approaches to methods. And I want to ask you guys about reconciling these. Zach, in conversations we had before our panel, you mentioned how much more we should be using digital drivers, how much more we should be using data and not maybe the surveillance that Lawrence is talking about, but definitely collecting facts and information about people and what they do. And Amanda, you emphasized a human-centered or behavioral science approach, right? So how do we reconcile this? This is this is related to the surveillance conversation. How do we recognize collecting all this data on people and doing these data-driven, data-centric types of goal setting and feedback mechanisms, with Amanda's emphasis on human-centered management techniques where you actually have to go talk to people. This is more like the crowdsourcing that we've been hearing about, or the really intensive work on the actual, trading floors or wherever else it is that Alex has been doing her research. How do you reconcile these things? Where do these two things fit together? And you guys are on the same team, so it was really interesting to see you come back with such different answers before the panel, and I was going to ask you about that.
I usually make Zach go first, but I'm gonna take this one for a moment, and Zach, you jump in. But Zach and I disagree on not very many things. One thing we do disagree on is, as he said earlier, I'm always the optimist in this relationship. but as far as these two things, the answer is we don't disagree. We think they're both equally important. And you actually will see us both emphasize the other just as much and take turns talking about them. I mean, as I listen to everything we've been talking about, all this does is drive up a bunch of really useful data that hopefully you then go talk to people about, because none of this on its own tells you anything. I mean, it's data. It's all a piece of information. It's all like crumbs that go somewhere. But until you contextualize it by actually talking to people about what it means, you've only gone so far. You've only gotten halfway there. And so I think using data to help chart your course is incredibly smart, because there are however many people within all our organizations. You're not going to be able to constantly talk to them all, but using data to guide you to where you should be going and what conversations you should be having when makes a ton of sense to me. But I don't think you can do one without the other. I think the two have to go together.
I fully agree. I do.
You want to put a pessimist spin on it, maybe, but now I'm joking.
No, I mean, the one thing I'll add, though, in response to what Lawrence and Beth were talking about is, I don't think what I'm about to say necessarily works in all contexts. Probably doesn't work in some of the surveillance contexts that Lawrence has spent much of his career in, but certainly one that worked in the compliance monitoring space that I have worked much of my career in, and that is using the data and using the insights that might be part of a monitoring or an oversight program to kind of challenge the trust and verify approach. And by that I mean moving the generation of those insights from after the fact being done, by compliance as part of a policing or a surveillance or a monitoring program. And I think we heard this term before, democratizing them in ways that put them on the front end of the transaction. And a place where we see this a lot, we talk about this a lot, we work with clients on this a lot, is in the anti-bribery and corruption space. Rather than just testing transactions after they've already happened, rather than just looking at how much has been spent and with whom and the patterns of behaviors and how that translates into risk after the fact, let's put some of that data and that information into the hands of the people at the front end who are managing this risk, who are overseeing those who are making decisions, or who are maybe in some cases making these decisions about investments themselves in ways that could create risk, and empower them to make better, more risk-aware decisions by giving them the same data that those in the compliance and risk and gatekeeper roles have and are looking at after the fact. And I think that that's actually a really good kind of marriage of the data and the behavioral or human-centered point of view. It's what do the people need? The people need better information to make more risk-aware decisions. So let's give it to them and give it to them in the form of, some of this rich data that many compliance programs have. And if they don't, they should have, to ensure that they're, kind of overseeing it appropriately. So also, I have to say, Alex has had her hand up for like the past hour.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
It's
too much to pay attention to every. I didn't even see that. Apologize.
But she just
jump
took
in.
it down. She
I
just
took it down. I was like, I think it's gone past it now. It's fine. It's fine. I'm not personally offended.
Just put it down to the moderator's incompetence. I don't even have that screen up. I was focusing on you guys and your faces. Alex, what did you want to say? I'm so sorry. And also, let me say for the audience too, there is a place for audience questions. Please save them to the end, and about we want to leave 20-30 minutes for audience questions too. We're not trying to shut anybody down. But Alex, the floor is completely yours.
I'll be very, very brief. No, so it feels like it has gone slightly past it. So tell me if it has. I guess it was coming back to Beth's point on that that democratization and the crowdsourcing and the I guess providing tech mechanisms for people to speak up. And yes, I think that's a great idea. I think the more we can push it down, the better. Rather than these very top-down initiatives. But again, in my experience, I think a key problem with reporting mechanisms is that they themselves are affected by the culture. So if you are in an environment where there's low psychological safety, you might not feel that you can report this, no matter how great the tools or the mechanisms are. And then alternatively, you are in an environment where risk-taking or unethical behaviors are normalized. Again, you might see no problem in what you're doing and what others around you are doing. So again, you wouldn't necessarily report it. So I guess my point was, I do think you need those at some point in organizations, that independent assessment of how people are behaving and what risk that might drive. And then my second point was, again, on the solutions, is how do we change behaviors? Come back to your question, Josephine, is getting everyone involved, both from I guess from all layers of the organization. So for example, local leaders, again, who have a disproportionate influence on what people do, as well as the senior leaders in terms of organization, and potentially changing those formal parts. So for example, performance and reward mechanisms that ultimately do drive many behaviors. So I think it was yes, democratize it, but bring in people from all across the organization around that central problem statement to then see what works and what doesn't.
You bring up a really fascinating point. What do you guys do with just a poisonous organization with a poisonous culture? We have, that's maybe, as Lawrence was talking about, has the wrong people in charge of surveillance and the wrong reporting structure and the rest of it. How do you even get started with an organization like that? Does it need completely new management from the outside, or how do you use what you have and turn it around?
I mean,
Well,
so you go for it, Beth.
Sorry. No.
You go.
All right. I'll start and then hope that you hop in. I think what we've been talking about for the last hour or so, it's sort of a great question because it's the culmination. I think the regulators can require some of these tools that we're talking about. And I do think you need either strong governance, which would be a board, the regulators have required someone on the board, as we have talked about, or if it's a large enough organization, it seems as though our conversation has been about large organizations where the trustees should get involved. But also I think the regulators, if they have a fresh, innovative perspective on what we want to do to have more compliant organizations, rather than thinking about punitive fines and just having someone come in and do an independent audit, there should be some sort of requirement for these additional tools and this additional type of transparency. So I do think it's got to be those outside stakeholders, whether it's the board or the regulators, and then using the technology.
So you're going to call me the Eeyore, but what we are increasingly suspecting that disclosure-based regulation just doesn't work. You can go ahead and tell the market what you want to tell the market, and the presumption is that there will be repercussions for that. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there aren't anymore for many of these things. So, we like the idea of disclosure and transparency, and we assume that there will then be some other follow-up coming from somewhere else, from some market force. And that doesn't seem to be there for a lot of these issues. Just, looking at the finance literature, for example. What do we do that's maybe not disclosure? What do we do beyond that? And is this a place in which you've seen regulators take different tactics?
Yeah, I'm gonna let others pipe in, but I think I would say, I don't think that the disclosure that we're talking about, since this is a practitioners panel, what I'm envisioning is more akin to, do you buy a consumer product when you go and you look at the consumer reviews and they're negative? Do you watch a movie that you see negative reviews of when you're selecting off of your streaming app? I think you'll see different behavior if disclosure wasn't written and ironclad by some of the best legal minds. And it isn't meant to be transparent to those making decisions about, I'm not going to work with that company because I think they're not run well. They don't have, let's just go back to the G and ESG. You could have a bad rating. You could have some sort of disclosure that's more akin to what you see in 2021 instead of some of the disclosure regimes that are very traditional and baked into regulation that isn't contemporary and not good for ingestion for those making decisions about whether to work with an organization or become a customer of that organization.
Well, I do think this kind of ties back to this point about, not just thinking of this as staying out of trouble or preventing fines and penalties, but instead realizing that doing business the right way actually is really good for business. So I think if you spin it a little bit, to the extent that you can get an organization to realize that you could improve the bottom line by doing things better, which I think is kind of where you're going a little bit with it, Beth, right? Like you could look at it either way. But if you can help an organization understand that it's not just avoiding fines and penalties, you can actually earn more money and, achieve the other goals that you're trying to achieve, that becomes an interesting motivation. And I think sometimes compliance is seen too much as just a cost center, and again, that gets us into this kind of segregation and lack of joined up approach anyway, which is problematic on so many other different fronts. I do think there's something very powerful about the customer and customer choice.
Yeah, I agree. I'd also add, Josephine, your original question was about culture. What do you do about kind of challenging cultures? And I think part of what Amanda and I try to do with our lab is to try to kind of normalize the review and assessment of culture in the same way that the assessment of risk is something that most organizations do and invest in. And I think it's relevant to your question because, look, this isn't always the case, but most of the time, when you look at the ideas that sort of live at the upper end of the organization, those ideas, those values are usually things that are, synergistic with or aligned to compliance. Things like transparency, things like integrity, things like ethical decision-making. Most leaders would say that those are things that they want and expect to see within their business. But what I don't think enough leaders have is a real meaningful assessment of whether or not those values and ideas that they're, promoting at the upper end are actually translating into the lived reality of their people. And that's exactly what we try to do. I'm sort of like now channeling our cultural psychologist, but we try to look at the ideas at the top, understand how those are institutionalized through policies and procedures and systems, understand the social norms that exist within the organization, and then really get down to that human level to understand whether or not the people at all levels of the organization share those values or see those values being a reality. And I think that when you do that kind of review and you show leaders the gap between the ideas that they aspire to or that they think exist and that lived reality, you have a really powerful starting point to take action. And I just don't think there's enough of that happening.
Well, it takes a little bit of courage. I mean, you started with, you have to normalize this concept. And I think that's right. In the same way that people didn't really want to do risk assessments for a while for fear of what they might find. It's the same concept, right? I go do a culture review and I figure out that people aren't living the values that we think people are living, and that scares organizations to some extent. But I think that all comes full circle. Until you understand what your culture is, you can't get to where you're trying to go. So it's the same argument that makes sense for commercial reasons as well as risk reasons, but it's a journey.
Let me ask you a little bit about this. So when we're talking about disclosure and transparency and these other things, it seems as though that's aimed at several different audiences, right? There's an internal audience where you can say, all right, this is our culture and this is healthy or this is not healthy, right? And here's what we should do about it. There's an external audience, one of which is regulators. We're being diligent and we see these flags and we're doing something about it, right? Early and in a responsible manner. And then there's the last market that Beth was actually talking about, which is the marketplace of consumers and or business partners. And the question is just what Amanda said and flagged is, if you have problems internally, do you really want to be advertising that to your business partners and your customers? Isn't that the moment at which, things get papered over? And isn't that the line then that customers are really only hearing about scandals, only hearing about things that blow up so big they make the evening news, that they're the Volkswagens or the Enrons or the whatever, and they really don't have bandwidth for, FCPA violations that are of small scales or whatever it is. And let me ask you about that. Is there a meaningful disciplinary action at with the customers in the marketplace for the cultural review stuff that you're talking about earlier?
I think there is, as we've talked about with ESG. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of capital going into, you can call it impact, you can call it sustainable or ESG investing. And there's lots of different tools. Maybe even Zach and Amanda have one at their firm where organizations within financial services and elsewhere are being graded and they're being scored on environmental, social, and governance attributes, not in the disclosure and transparency regime that we were just talking about, which can be overwhelming for internally, potentially that stakeholder, it's not overwhelming, but for other stakeholders, it may be. But this is as simple as color coding, red, yellow, green. And I'd offer that it's a really great opportunity for compliance thought leadership that an organization should not have a green G just because they have diversity on the board. It should be they have some of the best practices about behavioral incentives and prevention compliance, and that should be embedded into an ESG score. G should be, governance should be compliance.
Yeah, and on that point, I mean, just to, I think you're right. I think the focus, there's a moment, right? There is an ESG opportunity, and Zach will laugh because I see opportunities in everything. But it's true. For several years, we've been talking about how compliance and ESG actually should be working together to kind of help each other. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where organizations have different compliance and ESG teams just because that's how they've been built. But there is absolutely not only an opportunity, I think it's a necessity for the two to work together, because I don't see how you can possibly talk about all of the things that go into ESG without talking about risk. I mean, that's like what the whole thing is kind of based upon, and risk and compliance, right, are also go so hand in hand. And I think it's a missed play to not explore the two working together. And I do think people are increasingly, and we're seeing it, increasingly integrating these. And I think there's a lot more that can be done there. And I very much agree with you that it makes sense. That's where attention should be put, because I think you can make some real change by looking at those two together.
I was just going to add very briefly, I think that kind of external user data is really useful for understanding where hotspots might be in organizations, whether it's Glassdoor data, Trustpilot, customer data, really valuable. But second point is, I think because of the nature of financial services products, which is what my background is in, we can't always rely on customer user data to know that the customers have got good outcomes. So for example, customers can get really high net promoter scores, they can have a great experience with the organization, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've got a product that actually is fit for purpose, that meets their needs. And often there's value of the products is not known until way into the future. So I think, yes, very valuable, but B, you need other outcome measures to really understand, is the customer getting a good product for what they need.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. And we've just seen that with GameStop and Robinhood. And if you talk, like, my son is 19 and he doesn't care. He just doesn't want T+2 anymore. So I do think that he'll choose a financial services provider by the experience and then measure the risk. So I think this conversation is really helpful, but to your point, there's multiple stakeholders, and in this new sort of worldview that we're talking about, they all are important. It isn't just the consumer experience or the customer experience.
That's also the employee experience, right? I mean, like, everybody, going back to this culture point, people just aren't going to want to work in a place that doesn't have a good culture. So, people are prioritizing things perhaps differently than they did even a few years ago. And I think that's going to be a big driver. There are a whole bunch of audiences, and I think people just won't stay.
I think Josephine's point earlier about we're used to the concept of surveillance, but the newer entrants to the workforce are not. And whether or not that is going to be acceptable will be interesting to follow.
Alex, I want to make sure I gave you a chance to jump in if you want to jump in again.
No, I said everything on my last point. Thank you.
All right. Well, I did think somebody might say something along the lines, and let me just throw it out there as a devil's advocate to have you guys talk about this. Is ESG beyond the mandate of compliance, in the sense of, are we burdening too much a system that we've already talked extensively about as having flaws? Is this because there's a lot of debate over what ESG should be, whereas if you are talking about compliance, you have more of a set of things that are a little bit more, at least rule-based, maybe. Yes, the culture-based, unethical is unethical, to quote Zach. We have more of an idea here, whereas there's more evolution happening and development happening around a consensus for ESG issues and what the right focus might be there. And so I'm wondering, and I just to play devil's advocate out there, is that the same mechanism? Is it appropriately the same mechanism? Should you be in trouble for evolving standards the way that you are actively in trouble for compliance violations as we more narrowly understood them before? Or should this be something about culture where we want aspirational goals? Because a lot of what we talk about in compliance as there being a legal floor to things, and then we want ethical behavior above and beyond the legal floor. But, there is this idea that here's the checklist of what you can do and what you can't do. And it's a little bit harder to do that in also steering the conversation about ESG. And so let me ask you, do you see daylight between those two issues at all? Just to play devil's advocate.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Josephine. I'd be interested to see what others think as well. It starts from, what does it mean to the organization? My comments were, if you are a financial services company, let's just say you're an advisor that's going to determine when you recommend an investment, and you're going to say this investment meets your goal for an investment that has an ESG rating, because you as a consumer say you only want to invest in ESG, let's just say the word compliant organizations. But if the organization is not a target for investment within someone's portfolio as an ESG company, and they are simply announcing a sustainability report, or they're simply saying, we as an organization have adopted this sustainable development goal, Those are three widely different business models. And so I would say it depends on how the organization defines it. And when I talk about sustainable governance as sort of a replacement for compliance, I'm not saying compliance owns sustainable investing or impact investing or ESG investing. I'm just saying I don't think anyone should be credited with being on the continuum of an ESG or sustainable investment unless there's been very thorough due diligence about how effective the compliance program is. Because I agree with you to think that ESG as a subject matter should be owned within compliance is like saying compliance should own cybersecurity. There's a role for compliance, but compliance does not own cybersecurity because it's a different expertise. And I would say the same for ESG. It's a different expertise and there's a role. And I feel like we're at this tipping point where when we talk about some of the ineffectiveness of compliance, we talk about that CPI statistic, this is just an opportunity to leverage this megatrend right now, but not to own it. I agree. That is just going to burden the compliance department.
And one of the things that you mentioned before the panel started was your concern about the increasing potential for individual liability for compliance officers. So let me flesh you out on that. Talk to us about that, because that's an awfully scary trend to have marching, in step with increasing compliance's role and compliance's obligations to enforce so many different things.
Yeah, I think at a high level, what we've just talked about, and it seems like everyone on the panel agrees that we could increase the effectiveness of compliance programs if we decentralize a little bit and use some good technology. On the other hand, it seems mostly focused in the US, but I do think in the UK, this might be a real issue for AML officers. But whether one is a chief compliance officer, a CCO, or an AML officer, there are very troubling trends where the regulators will scapegoat and hold an individual personally accountable for a gap in compliance policies or compliance programs. The danger with that scapegoating is it sends a signal to management that may have already been inclined to just completely outsource compliance and not worry about the engagement and say, that's the compliance department's concern, not mine. So when the regulators give these signals or settle these cases, in my opinion, they're really hurting any of the efforts that we're talking about for behavioral incentives to get more people engaged in the program. And maybe you've read the risk alert, Josephine, but we are working with a compliance organization. There are some very troubling signals. If you read the latest ESG alert from the securities regulators in the US, when they are pointing out alerts, they have said compliance personnel are not knowledgeable enough about ESG. And they're making a causation to any kind of material misstatement or any kind of omission or potentially fraud is connected to compliance officers not having enough knowledge in the ESG front. So I would prefer to see a conversation that's not making a causation between compliance officer knowledge and making sort of greenwashing statements. But we have seen that as just this spring, and there's a concern if the cases do come out as anticipated that we may see lots of guidance that comes out in the US about ineffective compliance programs because compliance officers haven't studied enough on the ESG front.
That's great. Well, let me make sure, as promised, that we throw this open to our audience for questions if they have any, and also just make sure that we have talked to them about some of the lingo. So if you wouldn't mind, AML, anti-money laundering, and greenwashing. Do you want to define greenwashing?
Sure. Sorry for the lingo.
No. Just make sure everybody's speaking the same thing, even out in the audience, as we throw it open to them.
So when you look at, it's a really interesting space, ESG, all different types of companies are making statements about how they are in the continuum, grading themselves for environmental, social, and governance. And if they're using ESG and the ESG is really a marketing issue instead of a risk issue, as Amanda said, companies may come out with branding statements, with sustainability reports, with claims that are not backed in science or in data. And instead, it's just really great marketing, which has been called greenwashing.
Well, I have to say, I do have now the chat participants screen up. And I don't see any hands, but I would welcome anyone who is out there in the audience, if they would like to unmute their microphone and jump in. Genevieve, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll be delighted to ask a question. I'm Genevieve Hederinger. I'm a professor at Oxford University, and so I would just and sorry, I wasn't there at the beginning, so perhaps I missed something about this. I think the materiality of disclosures. So whether to what extent the lack of standardization in the way disclosure is currently done is a flow that is preventing any any reliable, in a way, is a flow in preventing greenwashing. In other words, without, it's just like in accounting, now there are these standardized items which allow comparability. So without those in the topics we're talking about, in those ESG topics, isn't greenwashing something that is just, sort of very difficult to prevent?
It's interesting. At the beginning, Genevieve, we talked about the US versus the UK approach when it comes to disclosures in the ESG front. So I do think in the UK with the taxonomy, you're going to see that. But in the United States, there's a belief that that compliance programs handle materiality of all different types of risks, and that we can use that structure in order to set standards at organizations about what the organization defines as material. And then if you look at some of the SEC commissioners, they've done a lot of good speeches. You can get them on YouTube, and it's just do what you say and say what you do. So it's completely opposite. You have the taxonomy in the UK, but in the US, it appears as though it's going to be more, do what you say what you do, define for yourself what you consider material to your business, make sure it's based on data and it's well-founded, good business judgment, but that they will not set standards. They'll probably continue to give guidance, particularly on the environmental front, but not on this bigger question that we've been talking about.
But I think this also goes back to, how do you get organizations to do this for reasons other than because regulators tell them to, right? So to the extent that you can get an organization internally to try to figure out all of these things really actually matter for their business, to their customers, to preventing regulation, to, all the very many things we've been talking about, that helps, because then you don't necessarily have to benchmark against the rest of the world. You are kind of benchmarking yourself a little bit. So it's not perfect, but I think it's one of the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, and that, like, there's this really great program at Berkeley and elsewhere, because at least in America, that's the raging debate. It's pretty chaotic to go from stakeholder, where you just know one, one group that's going to set the materiality threshold, which is moving to shareholder focus. And a shareholder focus is much more multi-dimensional. So yeah, it can get pretty complicated.
So the worries of Bob Eccles are actually not something that echoes very much in your practice.
Yeah, and there's lots of really innovative ways to deal with that. One of them is organizations are changing corporate structure to allow for reporting for stakeholders instead of shareholders. The other ones are just having a principle statement to say, this is how we define ESG for us, and this is what we commit to. So we define our own materiality, and you make it very clear. Josephine raises some good points about disclosure and transparency. So it's really striking that balance so it doesn't end up that it's so complicated that nobody really understands what your statement is. So it's definitely a work in progress.
All right, I'm trying to make sure I give space for anyone else who wants to jump in. Deirdre?
Yes, I'll go ahead and jump in. So I found the conversation today quite interesting and illuminating, and I just wanted to add a little bit to Amanda's point, because I know that's one that we really, I work in the corporate compliance field, so it's one that we really focus on a lot, is just stressing basically from the get-go with new employees just the importance of this, and it's a differentiator, and I think you see more and more movement in that direction, and I think that helps with some of the other things that we've talked about today with setting the right culture and then monitoring that over time, you know, making sure is our culture progressing the way we want to? Are people feeling comfortable reporting? Are they in line with the values? What are their perceptions of integrity and compliance, you know, within our organization? So I think all of these things really do come into play. And kind of on the ESG, I think I sit in Switzerland, so maybe we have a slightly different perspective. It's not quite nearly so regulated as compared in the US. But what I feel like I'm seeing in the ESG space is more of a very different approach to how we want to do business. So kind of taking it from the days of Milton Friedman and kind of adapting and growing it into a much more sustainable, long-term business approach. And so that's kind of interesting to hear. I mean, I'm not in financial services either, so, you know, we're not looking at financial industries or something like that. But that from the field that I'm in, that seems to be more the focus that we're looking at when it comes to ESG. And so I'm just thought I'd share that as well. But very interesting panel. Thanks.
I love that you said that, though, because it makes me go back to isn't that what we should be trying to do in compliance, right? Because it's more about how to do. I mean, that's the whole point, you know. So
it's how you do business on a daily basis.
Exactly. So I feel like when I say that there's like an opportunity here, it's all of a sudden the business is engaged in listening and focused on this. And so it's an opportunity, I think, to do compliance better. I mean, yes, it's an opportunity to get ESG right, but it's also very much, I think, an opportunity to do compliance better for exactly the reasons you just said.
Exactly. And it's setting the tone for this is how we conduct business, and this is why we're here. And this is, you know, our mission. So I think, you know, to the extent, I think you can leverage ESG quite a bit in the compliance field. And then where I work, it's actually separated. It's kind of sustainability and compliance, but we work, you know, very, very closely day in and day out on the same topics, and try to do as much as you can as far as leveraging the resources that we each come to bear.
Ronit, did you have a question?
No, thank you. And I'm so sorry I came late.
No, we're delighted to see you.
I missed it, and I'm so sorry. And I wish there's a way to, you know, to cover it up.
Well, I hope that we will post this recording on the website eventually. We're hoping to build an archive of conversations about compliance in all its different forms.
So compliance is the most important thing in my PhD, so please do. And
Thank you.
Again, I'm so sorry. nothing to say.
Well, thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see you. What is your dissertation about?
My dissertation is about the part of the financial consultants in discriminalization. And I mean in anti-money laundering. And I think there's a part for the lawyers, you know, and part of for the CPAs. I'm a CPA, okay. And somehow we changed the rules and help do the money laundering without even noticing. And I want to expose it. I want to show it, and I want the whole sector of financial services to know and understand what are the mistakes. So compliance is very important for me.
Definitely. Thank you for what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
All right, with our last couple of minutes, let me open the floor to anyone else in the audience or anyone from the panel who has a last question or comment. Something they want to say? Isabel?
Hi, it's been really great today, thank you. I was just wondering, currently there's been a lot more conversation about deregulation and making ourselves more competitive in terms of COVID recovery. And I was wondering where you saw the room for self-reporting and building up internal methods of compliance and regulation, sort of, I guess, replacing actually government regulation. Thank you.
I'm happy to take that one. I was going to say very much my personal view is at least in financial services is no, there's absolutely a role for the regulator. I think the incentives are very strong that exist in the financial services market, and moving to a more, I think, self-reporting or self-regulated system wouldn't necessarily achieve the goal of regulation to get better outcomes. Yes, I think the regulator should be looking at how it regulates, but I don't think moving to a system of more self-reporting would be in the best interests of consumers or probably in the market either. It's just my own view, but yeah.
And I'll be a little controversial and take potentially the other side of that and think about the Madoff scandal, how one of the biggest frauds had been regularly audited, and Bernie Madoff wasn't discovered, and we still have fairly high corruption. So I think with where we are in 2021, there's a tremendous opportunity to increase self-reporting. I don't think you completely replace the regulatory regime, but I do think you could reform.
This is a super lawyerly answer, but I think you need both. I mean, I think for it to really work, you do need the regulation. I think you see more disclosure and action and resources where there's higher enforcement. I mean, that's just the reality, that you take the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, and there's been, many years now of extensive enforcement, and that has been a tool that has helped companies get resources where they need resources to dedicate energy to figuring out how to build these compliance programs. So I think if you take that away completely, I think it becomes a harder uphill battle. But at the same time, I don't think, as we said, kind of at the very beginning, regulation alone and the penalty alone isn't enough, right? You really need organizations to want to be doing the right thing because it's the right thing, not for fear of what happens if you don't do the right thing. So I think we need both.
Thank you.
Okay, I have 12:29 and we end at 12:30. I want to throw this to Zach to ask him if he has any last thoughts, because we got to get a last word in from everyone, and then we'll wrap up. So Zach, did you have any last thoughts or anything that you want to leave us with?
I guess I'll leave you with this. You know, you said before that in driving the distinction between ESG and compliance, that compliance is often very rules-based, and it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be. So let's not let it be that. And let's also make sure that ESG doesn't become that, because that's our tendency.
That's a very interesting way to leave it. Yeah, that we have patterns. We have patterns in compliance, and we have patterns in our behavior, don't we? All right, thank you, everyone. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. I'll check about getting the recording up for those people who are coming and going from different time zones. So be well. Take care.
Awesome.
Hope to see you next
Bye.
year.
Everybody.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.